So it's a pleasure to introduce today's King's India Institute research seminar and book discussion. My name is Louise Tillin. I'm the director of the India Institute. And today we have the pleasure of discussing this new book by my colleague, Dr. Anastasia Piliavsky, Nobody's People, Hierarchy as Hope in a Society of Thieves. Before I introduce our panel of discussants today, I think worth just noting why this is an important book and likely to be a book that will generate much discussion, both among South Asianists, for whom hierarchy is a concept that has, of course, been central to understanding of Indian society and of caste in particular. But this book offers, I think, a very fresh, certainly bold, of course, nuanced argument that urges us to recapture the idea of hierarchy as a normative commitment and normative idea that both structures social life in India, but that also may be a lens through which we should understand aspiration in India. So this is a book that we will open up for discussion in today's seminar. Generate much wider debate in the field, both in the field of South Asian studies, but also in the discipline of anthropology more widely. I should introduce the author a little more first before I introduce the panel. So Anastasia Piliasky has been a senior lecturer in anthropology and politics at the King's India Institute for the last 3 years and joined King's College London from King's College Cambridge recently before then. She is currently on research leave from the India Institute as principal investigator of a major ERC-funded starter grant on politics in its vernaculars, which seeks to use India as a means to generate new understandings of vernacular politics in much of the world. I'm very glad that we are joined today by a distinguished panel of discussants who will our discussion today. So we have Professor Jonathan Spencer joining us from the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Melinda Banerjee from the University of St Andrews, a modern historian, and Dr. Arsalan Khan from Union College, New York, but not actually speaking to us from New York today, but from Karachi, if I'm right, certainly from Pakistan. I will first turn to Anastasia to speak for around 20 minutes to introduce the major themes and argument in the book. And then our discussants will talk, Arsalan first, then Melinda, and then Jonathan, and then we'll open out to wider discussion. As ever, please use the chat function if you'd like to raise comments during the presentations, and the Q&A box is there for any questions that you would like to pose to the author or to the discussants. But with that, I will turn over to Anastasia to offer some opening remarks.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Melinda and Arsalan and Jonathan, for joining me today, and Vignesh for organizing the meeting. Having presumably just read the book, all of you are in a much better position than I am to speak about it. So all of you out there in the audience, you better listen to the discussants much more carefully than to me. But still, I will make a few remarks on some of the number the book having said. So when I was doing field work, on which this field work is based in rural southern Rajasthan, I got a bad case of pneumonia. This is pre-COVID, so people weren't as worried about such things at the time. Now, a kind family from the local market town, which was called Begun, took me into their more comfortable lodgings than the charpai that I was occupying at the time in the village. Very kind of them. The head of the family was a matriarch called Baiji, or a respected sister. She was from a family of royal drummers, one of the old service families in the local little kingdom. And she took it upon herself to instruct me while I convalesced in the ways, as she said, of her culture, teaching me how to speak and dress and eat like a proper Rajasthani. I wasn't a very good student, of course. I drank, I smoked, I lived away from my then husband and drove a motorcycle around town, as she said, like a boy. None of this, of course, was appropriate for a young married woman, but as Baiji taught me her culture, I also did my best to explain mine to her. She came to appreciate that women from the English caste, chose their own husbands, they traveled abroad on their own, and they even got divorced if they wanted to. But there was one thing about my marital life that she just could not understand. When my then husband visited me in Begun, in the town, Baiji grew deeply perplexed by the way that she watched us relate to each other. We went about town together, cooked and ate together with my husband. We laughed and chatted and fought as if we were equals. Baiji's husband had been dead for some time at that point, but his image, his picture hung high on the wall, and every morning Baiji adored it with garlands of fresh marigolds. His memory was so sacred that she would not so much as utter his name. And here I was asking my husband to make me cups of tea. Her son explained to her that in England, husbands and wives lived together like equals, and as he put it, like friends, which was the idiom in which he could express a relation of equality. That she could not understand. How could such a vital relationship in one's life be equal? Friends, she said, come and go, but there's only one husband. No wonder, she remarked, the English get divorced every other day, adding pointedly, in Rajasthan, we treat our husbands like gods. Now, in Baiji's world, rank correlated directly, not inversely, with care and intimacy. Baiji's family was extremely warm and tight-knit, and I loved being with them, but nobody in it was equal to anyone else. Every part of daily life, from getting out of bed to eating and bathing and dressing and going out and going back to bed, followed a strict order of precedence. Every evening, Baiji burnt incense before her husband's icon, and every morning her children and grandchildren touched her feet while she dispensed to them her blessings. She was the head of the family. Eventually, when I joined in this routine, she welled up with tears, tapped me on the head, and said lovingly, "Now you really are my daughter." Now, Baiji found it inconceivable that a husband could be one's equal, or indeed, even more importantly, that he should be. Of course, your husband is bigger than you, she said. He has more strength. And she was saying this in response to some of my feminist musings on marital equality. How else could he feed you? Friends cannot possibly care for you the way your parents or husband or elder brothers do. They may have responsibilities to you, but they're not responsible for you. They're not responsible for caring for you in the way that parents are responsible for their children or husbands are for their wives. And isn't responsible care and provision what one wants from a marriage? Which is why being subordinate to, or more precisely, being smaller than, as is in the local idiom, one's husband, is not humiliating, but conversely central to a good, loving relation. And so Baiji, in teaching me how to be a good wife, kept repeating, this is how we serve our husband. We massage his legs, we cook, we clean. It's a bit of a joke given what was actually going on. Now, Euro-Americans who are going on a date looking for a potential husband look for parity, whether in their taste in music or shared political views or common family backgrounds. They might delight in each other's differences, but it's things that they discover to have in common that will suggest to them that a relationship is in the cards. To Baiji, however, this logic made no sense at all. Surely someone who can protect and provide for you cannot be your equal, making inequality basic to the most important vital relationships in one's life, between husbands and wives, parents and children, gods and devotees, ancestors and descendants, patrons and servants. These unequal, asymmetrical, hierarchical bonds were important not only as practical arrangements, not only because people depended on them materially, because they were sources of sustenance and employment, even if, of course, very importantly, they were that too, they were significant existentially as sources of social selves. Now, every social entity, be it an individual person, a family, a village, a caste, a political party, a student union, a professional guild, or a sports club, could not exist in India without a patron of their own. So each household, each party office, each police station has an image of their patron or matron displayed prominently on their walls. Talk of feeding that surrounds discussions of patronage, what it is precisely, and what patrons are for, is exactly about this existential significance of the patron-servant bonds. Now, as anthropologists have long pointed out, in South Asia, sharing food, what we call with a fancy word commensality, is not only about nourishment, it's also about social existence, which is why eating in India is surrounded by such rigid prescriptions. So by sharing food with people, people share something of their self. They share what anthropologist McKim had once called biomoral substance, something of the very essence of their selves. Now, in northern India, people talk of something called khandan, literally the gift of food, to refer to collective substance that one shares with members of one's community, substance that one also inherits from one's patron. What anthropologist Marshall Sullins called a mega person who stands on top of that community and affords them their social self. And that person may be divine, it may be a human who has become divine, or a divinity who was once human. Now, the more basic idea here is that everyone comes from somebody else. People all come from other people in a process we might call exogenesis, right? Coming from outside. So to be someone, one must be someone's. Not just eat from everyone, as people say, and anyone, but to belong to someone, meaning to be is to belong. Now, if this is starting to sound a little esoteric, I first came across that couldn't have been more concrete. Some years before my fieldwork, the village I lived in with a people called Khanjars, who were the heroes of my book, was razed to the ground. The consequences of the massive pogrom were still everywhere. Many houses were still in ruins, and the cenotaphs of the 11 people who were murdered during the pogrom could be seen from any point in the village. Now, Khanjars are professional robbers. They're a caste of professional robbers who rustle cattle and burgle village homes, something I won't really go into here now. So it's not altogether surprising that they do retaliatory attacks. Now, what startled me when I spoke with the perpetrators of the pogrom, who were still out and about nearly 20 years on, was not really the violence as such. I could understand that. Few people would tolerate incessant burgling, or even that they admitted it openly, but it was their sense of entitlement to it, indeed pride in, and their justification for what they have done. They narrated, and one brandished the cane he had used on the occasion, patting it menacingly on the palm of his hand. Khanjars roam about like rats, he said, going here and there. They take from one man from another. You tell me, whose people are they? No, he swiped the air sideways with his hand. They have no lord, no master. They eat from everyone's hand. When it comes to Khanjars, you can be sure there's no truth, right, or justice. They are useless, bekar, useless or disposable. Now, in the local calculus of rank, Khanjars was seen indeed as below the sweepers or leathersmiths, who are among the lowest of the untouchables. And they were so not because they were ritually polluted, I'd realized, but because they were socially unattached, having failed in the eyes of their neighbors, and in fact in their own eyes, to secure good and proper, durable, exclusive, parentage-like ties with patrons. So as a people with no certain sources of self, with no certain khandan, who ate from everyone's hand, as people put it, lacked integrity. elected both in the metaphoric sense that we use the word to mean a lack of moral rectitude, and in the more concrete antique sense of being whole. They were nobody's people, and so worthless, dispensable, as the man quite literally said, a mere vermin who could be killed with no regret or remorse. Now, the book isn't quite as grim as all that. Quite on the contrary, much of it is about the other, cheerier side of this moral logic of unequal, vertical attachments, to which my story's heroes, conjurers, and their neighbors in the nearby town and villages look in their pursuits of social ambitions. It's about ties as enablers of social freedom, the freedom to pursue better lives, the freedom to move up in one's world, not out of it, but up within it, through a logic of hierarchic, normatively unequal relations predicated on difference instead of equivalence, predicated on mutual dependence instead of autonomy, in which we progressive moderns now tend to conceptualize freedom, predicated on the idea that one can only move up in the world if there is a world to move up in, through the relations in which it consists, through this world's social logic, in the eyes of the people with whom one shares this logic, predicated on the idea that one can only move up if there's an up and a down, that one cannot climb on plateaus. Now, the book is centrally about individual ambitions, not just collective aspirations. It's about individual ambitions which have long been treated as the antithesis of hierarchy, both by social scientists and lay people alike, but which I argue in the book, hierarchy in fact enables. Now, the book isn't only about conjurers or rural Rajasthan or even India. My hope is that readers, wherever their cultural or whatever their cultural or political predispositions, would see something of their own lives reflected in the lives that I've described in it. For however sincere our commitments to equality, our lives are framed by hierarchical norms, whether they structure relations in our families, with politicians, or with colleagues in our middle-class careers, in law, in business, in politics, or in academia, shaped as these are profoundly by patronage ties. Now, the book issues a challenge to the egalo-normative hegemony of contemporary social science, which has grown increasingly allergic to any difference that actually makes a difference. We talk of diversity, but deep moral differences are not tolerated at all. To the social science discourse that has come to treat equivalence as an all-purpose, inviolable social good, as the necessary condition of social justice, fulfillment, freedom, and joy. Now, to ask one's readers to take hierarchical norms seriously as norms is a lot to ask, because it is to ask to suspend one's most dearly held value and think and feel one's way into a world that feels very topsy-turvy. This is hard work, but should the readers be willing to spare this moral effort, the results ought to be rewarding and possibly even fun, or such at least is my hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, and I will turn now to Arslan Khan.
You know, my own work also deals with the question of hierarchy, and I think many of the comments that I'd like to present here are actually responses that I get to my own work as a kind of challenge, and that I've tried to wrestle with. So I would like to sort of present some of them to Anastasia in the hopes that she could, you know, also help me think through these questions. So Anastasia Piliasky argues that despite the fact that the most prominent theories of hierarchy, like those of Louis Dumont, have come out of India, there is now almost no ethnographic attention to how hierarchy as a value shapes social life in India. By value, Piliavsky means a normative commitment. Not only describes the state of the world, but also describes how people should act towards others, and as a means of thinking about and reckoning with the world. Okay? Scholars of India, Piliavsky argues, have failed to account for this pervasive social phenomena because their own normative commitments to egalitarianism prevent them from recognizing hierarchy as a value in this normative sense. Piliavsky's argument challenges dominant currents of critical theory that are, on the one hand, analytic projects that examine how unequal power relations structure social life, and critiques of social inequality. Saba Mahmood famously noted that feminism's prescriptive project of liberating women from relations of subordination has hampered the analytic project of understanding forms of women's agency that do not abide by the terms of liberal egalitarianism. And we'll come back to liberalism and egalitarianism at the end because Anastasia has interesting things to say about that as well. Piliavsky's argument, similarly, is that normative egalitarianism prevents the analyst from understanding how hierarchy can be a value in social life. My own work also adopts a similar approach, but I do think that denaturalizing egalitarianism, although denaturalizing egalitarianism is critical, one also runs the risk in such an endeavor in naturalizing hierarchy. David Graeber has a critique of the use of the term hierarchy as already, says it's usually used when we've already accepted its basic terms. So Louis Dumont's classic Homo hierarchicus is a key touchstone for anthropological understandings of hierarchy. Dumont argues that the paramount value of Indian society is purity, and it is according to this that people and things are ranked, creating a hierarchical and holistic world that is in marked contrast to the egalitarian individualism of the West. Piliasky argues that Dumont's conflation of caste and with hierarchy has led scholars of India to throw out the study of hierarchy, which is a much broader value in Indian social life than just caste. And in fact, she says that caste itself may not be necessarily hierarchical. Unlike Dumont, who assumes that each society is characterized by a single paramount value, Piliasky notes that there are many competing values that structure social life in India. Yet she focuses on hierarchy as a value that permeates much of Indian social life. Having dispensed with Dumont's holism, Anastasia comes up with an alternative explanation for the basis for hierarchy. So as opposed to having a single value like purity, she finds an answer in the very definition of hierarchy. Hierarchy, she says, can be differentiated from inequality by a kind of logic of reciprocity, wherein both those higher up and those lower down are dependent on one another. But the question does arise, why is a relation of hierarchical reciprocity and responsibility rather than one based on equality and equity desirable for the Kanjars? And what precisely counts as reciprocity and responsibility? How is this hierarchical relation formulated and legitimated, and one might add naturalized in Indian social life, or in the life, at least in Rajasthan, where she studied? Here, I think there is a bit of a risk. I mean, I'd like to hear Anastasia's thoughts on this. Right? If a normative commitment to egalitarianism treats all forms of hierarchy as exploitation and domination, then leaving these questions unanswered about how hierarchical reciprocity is constituted runs the risk of naturalizing hierarchy. So I want to sort of, I wrestle with this idea myself, so I want to kind of raise just a few points. So Anastasia argues that the materialist readings, even though she kind of argues against Dumont's single paradigm, she accepts the basic kind of notion, central value of Indian social life. She says that against the materialist readings, which pose no challenge to Dumont because they presume that the pursuit of power and wealth are universal ends of life, which she argues smuggles back in assumptions about kind of maximizing individuals. But I want to say that if we define hierarchy as a kind of reciprocity, an asymmetrical exchange between people higher up and people lower down, then it does actually raise some questions about how people higher up have the means to enact hierarchy, to fulfill their obligations in a hierarchical system. So if you reject Dumontian holism, organized around a paramount value, which anchors Dumont's conception of hierarchy, and replace it with asymmetrical reciprocity, then you do have to answer the materialist question. If the goal in this system is to become a patron and a big man, then one must acquire the material resources to do so. And I think this brings up all manner of questions that are addressed, Anastasia's thoughts on them. brings up all manner of questions about how those at the top of such hierarchies generate and sustain the wealth and power to become patrons in the first place and perform their morally laden hierarchical duties. In the world of hierarchical exchange happening between patrons and clients, there may be a sense of reciprocity, but this hierarchical reciprocity, one can say, also depends on closing off other egalitarian possibilities. For instance, if meeting the demands of hierarchical reciprocity requires land ownership, then hierarchy depends on ensuring such land is not readily available, making such land scarce. One can think, for instance, about arguments about primitive accumulation and efforts to kind of displace people from the land. And of course, in India, as elsewhere, there are great struggles over land, over property, over rights. And so the hierarchical system kind of presupposes that all of those struggles are generally off the table. Okay? And this is important, I think, to recognize that material basis for hierarchy, because it opens up the space to think about the relationship not only of hierarchy and responsibility and care, but also hierarchy and violence, and the way that hierarchy and violence, both notions of responsibility and care and violence and domination, may be entangled in the same kinds of hierarchical forms. Okay. So one can imagine, for instance, situations when farmers and peasants find such hierarchical arrangements acceptable, but one can also imagine when they find them unacceptable. This could lead them, of course, to seek egalitarian, seek other hierarchical alternatives, but it may also lead them into egalitarian possibilities, drawing them into direct conflict with the judgment and the system as a whole. It is in this sense that I think the hierarchical and egalitarian possibilities should be thought of in the kind of same frame. And I think there's maybe in the book, hierarchy is the frame, and that's to challenge the kind of normative egalitarianism that I think frames analytic theory. But I think egalitarianism might fall away from the analysis a bit, and there might be some value in bringing that in as a kind of competing frame. And because these two possibilities do exist in almost any political context. Hierarchy do not only have care and responsibility, but violence built into them. And violence is often meted out to those who do not abide by the terms of the hierarchical arrangement. And Anastasia focuses on the wide, so for instance, focuses on the wide usage of the ma-bap or mother-father kind of kinship metaphor to describe relations with various political authorities. This kinship metaphor is meant to invoke hierarchical relations of reciprocity and care, deemed intrinsic to kinship. But even in hierarchical relations in kinship, as feminists have long noted, exploitative and violent, these relations also have exploitative and violent potential built into them. Indeed, the reason to invoke kinship relations is generally with political authorities is to domesticate the exploitative and potentially violent possibilities that do exist in relations with various political authorities. And political authorities themselves invoke such relations of the sort of, we could think of like the image of the father state to define of action of subordinate people, whether it be the people or it be a group of people. And so I would like to sort of pose that as a kind of general question, that if hierarchy, it's right, if I'm right, hierarchy has this kind of double quality, right? It both anchors a kind of model of hierarchical love and care, affection that we do see also in families, but on the other has this kind of dangerous possibility of discipline, violence, and authoritarianism. And we think that thinking about that kind of duality helps us, in a sense, think through both the value of hierarchy and its otherwise egalitarianism, and why people might seek out egalitarian possibilities. So I think the hierarchy and egalitarianism exist as values in all social and political contexts, and the analytic task is to show how one or the other becomes and is sustained as the encompassing value. If patrons become too violent, exploitative, and oppressive, clients might seek out alternative patrons. They also might seek out egalitarian ends. The egalitarian values of citizenship rights embodied in India's constitution carry the promise of equality. So we do take up these egalitarian sensibilities of citizenship rights. So Nobody's People could not be a more timely and important intervention in discussions about hierarchy and egalitarianism. Political life around the world is increasingly permeated by an abiding nostalgia for a return to quote-unquote natural hierarchies between children and parents, women and men, lower and upper caste, religious adherents and religious authorities, minorities and majorities, the people and the state. There seems to be we're living in a moment where people want hierarchy and they want their hierarchies back, and they use hierarchy in a sense as a political idiom against the state, often against other forms of authority. So this makes understanding the value of hierarchy as a key moral and political challenge in our times. And Piliavsky shows how the egalo-normative sensibilities that shape our analysis impede our understanding of hierarchy as social value. I would say, add that then the critical task is also to show how hierarchy as a value is constituted, sustained, and challenged at the nexus of democracy and capitalism. And I know Anastasia has forthcoming work and other work on this. But I think that understanding hierarchy in relationship to these to the political economy and to democracy and to political life is really a kind of critical task that Nobody's People really opens the door for us to think about. So I'll go ahead and stop there.
Thank you very much, Arslan. That really helped to open out a very interesting set of questions. I won't ask Anastasia to respond yet. I'm going to ask her to patiently wait for more questions to be opened out and turn to Melinda Banerjee next.
Thank you very much, Louise, and thank you very much, Anastasia, for making me read your absolutely enthralling book. I want to start with a vignette from your book, which immediately captured me, where you said, this character in your book, Ramesh, she says that the only time he has heard the word barabar, equal or even, was when shopkeepers struck a deal in distant Gujarat. And this immediately brought to my mind the question of political economy, as Arslan, of course, raised now. The word barabar, as you say, of course, roots the notion of equality in abstract exchange value, more specifically in commodity production and exchange, particularly in conditions of capitalism. And this, of course, is perhaps one of the central aspects in which equality has been framed in modern times. Equality as a metrical, as an arithmetic, calculated value, which is rooted in commodity production and exchange. And I'm thinking of Andrew Sartori's magnificent book, Liberalism and Empire, which shows how the idea of equality spreads in the Indian countryside, in the Bengali countryside, especially among Bengali Muslim peasants, because of the spread of the commodity production and exchange, which makes ideas of production and economy central to the way equality is understood. Sartori, of course, draws upon the very important work of Alfred Zomrettel on real abstraction and on Moshe Postoni as well. He criticizes subaltern studies for its anthropologizing impulses in always pointing towards the other as having other values. Now, in my understanding, reading your book, what immediately captured my heart was the way that, to me, it seemed that the way that anthropologists, different from the way that historians and especially global historians are going. Global historians increasingly describe a world that looks flattened and homogeneous, unified by circulations of commodities, of capital, of ideas, of labor, whereas you and other anthropologists are often emphasizing alterity, often emphasizing radical difference. Now, what I get from your book, therefore, is how to think about social relationships beyond this kind of capitalist globality that global historians have been very acute. I'm thinking, for example, of the plethora of works which have come out from legal history, from intellectual history, from political history, on the globalization of ideas and practices of constitutional liberalism, of elections, and so on, which try to understand how the birth of Indian democracy can be equated with the birth of the Indian constitution, constitutionalist rights, and so on. But what your book provokes me to ask is, can we think about social interdependence and freedom? Can we think of democratic values, modification, beyond the constitutionalist status liberalism and neoliberalism that has often been at the center of much of historical scholarship? And how can we think through and beyond about Indian democracy through these kind of other ways, other modes of conceptualizing social relationship? Or to put this very blatantly, can we think about freedom, which is achieved not through commodity production and exchange, not through the neoliberal capitalist atomized individual, not through the homo economicus, but through relationality, through social interdependence? Now, of course, the question that immediately would be raised is, and I'm sure, Anastasia, you have faced this question umpteen times, is, does this run the risk of fetishizing inequality? When we emphasize social interdependence, when we criticize liberalism and especially neoliberal capitalism, are we promoting a nostalgia for pre-capitalist inequality? And I think your book exactly provokes us not to do that. It provokes us to think theoretically beyond easy conceptual oppositions. And I want to pick on some of the very brief remarks you place at the end of your book, where you talk about equality as leveling up. Now, the reason it captured my attention was it kind of drew me to the stuff that I have been looking at from intellectual history perspectives on how ideas of freedom and autonomy in India have evolved over the last 3,000 years through the collectivization and expansion of ideas of divinity and regality. So for me, hierarchy is not just a thing, it's a dialectic. It's a dialectic through which the one below can actually become a master. And I'm thinking of Theodore Preferis's work on Vedic India, on Dirk Kolf's and Surajit Sinha's work on Kshatriyization and Rajputization in pre-colonial India, on William Pinch's and my own work on Kshatriyization in modern India. So if we take the example of a community like the Rajbangshis in South Himalayan Bengal, the largest Dalit community in contemporary West Bengal, they do take hierarchy very seriously, but they understand hierarchy in dialectical terms as something which needs to be labored through in order to realize individual and collective divinity and regality within the peasant individual and collective self. And that's why among the Rajbangshis, as well as among other Indian thinkers, including notably Nazrul Islam, the concept of Atma Shasana, self-rule, is the process of becoming the divine, of becoming the master. And of course, a lot of Indian feminist discourses by Sarojini Naidu, by Begum Rokeya, are precisely about this dialectical way through which women can achieve everyday divinity and even queenship. Anastasia's book, of course, points to the ubiquity of ideas about the master, malik, and responsibilities of masters to those below. These are, of course, part of centuries-old reflections in India about Raj Dharma, about the responsibilities and limits of power, even about the origins of power in social contract. But I would add to this, equally important is not just the concept of master, the mastery, but of becoming a master, becoming a malik, kshatriya, or god. And I think this needs to be underlined. The secret history of Indian democracy lies precisely in this leveling up to become master. And dare I say, the secret history of Indian equality also lies here. If we look, for example, at the corpus of poetry and songs attributed to the 15th century weaver Saint Kabir, we will see that the way he conceptualizes samata, not arithmetic, calculative, commercial equivalence, but sameness, samata and same are of course cognates. Samata is achieved through the realization of the divine in the high caste and in the low, in man and woman, and even in the human and the non-human. Now, what this points to is a way of achieving freedom, as Anastasia's book rightly highlights, but I would also add actually also equality, or rather samata, through social interdependence, through realizing our mutual obligations to each other. South Asian history has after all attested not only to kingships, but also to non-monarchic polities, from late first millennium BC Gana or popular polities, explicitly referred to as democracies by classical Greco-Roman observers, which operate through collective deliberation and decision-making, as Yelevutas shows in his work. In fact, Yele and I are currently writing a pamphlet on how to think about freedom through interdependence of social beings, humans as well as non-humans, and thereby overcome the predicament of capitalist atomization that extracts value from humans and non-humans and precipitates the age of the Anthropocene or Capitalocene, or even, as many call it, the Necrocene, the age of extinction of species and communities. So to conclude, for me, the abiding value of Anastasia's books lies in emphasizing the achievement of the good life, of freedom, of hope and aspiration through social interdependence. Whether one agrees with all her conclusions or not, and I personally would see her book as something that I neither agree nor disagree with, but dialectically wrestle with, this work will remain a must-read for anyone interested in global politics and social theory, for presenting so clearly how provincial, how utterly narrow the world of bourgeois capitalist neoliberalism is, how narrow and provincial these bourgeois capitalist ideas of equality are, which are predicated on commodity production and exchange, on arithmetic equivalence, which actually reinforces deep-rooted exploitative inequalities, and how these inequalities can precisely still be overcome by drawing on communitarian modes of social being that have not been eroded yet in vast parts of the world, whether we are thinking of India or Aboriginal Australia or indigenous South America. So Anastasia's work for me shows not how to fetishize hierarchy, but how to dialectically labor through hierarchy in order to achieve samatha, or equality, we can call it. If only we had the eyes to see that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melinda. And I will now pass the floor to Jonathan Spencer to offer his comments.
Yes, more dialectical wrestling. I'm actually going to read my comments in a futile attempt at self-discipline, and that means necessarily there's a little bit of repetition from some of the points that have been made by the two earlier speakers, but also slightly more gratifyingly, there's a degree of kind of confluence in some of our arguments, particularly I think around freedom and violence, which I come to at the very end. But I'll start by thanking Anastasia and her colleagues for inviting me to participate in this event. Nobody's People is a rather remarkable first monograph, in equal parts enchanting, provoking, challenging, witty, illuminating, and occasionally, and ever so slightly, just a teensy bit annoying. No one familiar with the author or her previous work would expect anything less. I'll start with a fieldwork memory just to establish that I'm an anthropologist and not a historian or anything else. Fieldwork memory from about 15 years ago. With a group of fellow non-Sri Lankan researchers, I'm visiting a site in the east of Sri Lanka, which has become the locus of a legal controversy, pitting Buddhist claims to the ruins of a stupa against the rival claims of the Muslim villagers who have lived in and around the ruins for generations. Our guide to the site is a minor local political figure, a Sinhalese Buddhist, who at each stop goes out of his way to show us what he describes as the encroachments and transgressions of the Muslims. He speaks only in Sinhala. I have to translate for my companions. At the end of the tour, he outside, that's me and my companions, now have to take all we've learned from him and present it to the government in Colombo and tell them to intervene and to stop the Muslims from further misdeeds. Then, unexpectedly, he grabs my hand, looks me forcefully in the eye and says, we now have a bond of trust. I think there's a bit of chest beating went on as well, don't we, Mahathir? I am nonplussed, apparently co-opted into the skein of hierarchical entanglements, which are the stuff of Anastasia's book, and which can be seen at work across South Asia. Anastasia starts small and local, with the travails of a colourful gallery of ne'er-do-wells, a sometime criminal caste, the Kanjas of Rajasthan, and their need of attachment to more respectable patrons. That relationship between a patron and a provider of a service provides the template for the book's analysis of hierarchy as a social idiom, and not least as an idiom of aspiration. To improve yourself, you must cultivate attachments to bigger and better patrons. Now, hierarchy is anthropology and sociology. And after a half-century of criticism, the decision to resurrect the spirit of Louis Dumont is, if nothing else, a bold one. Anastasia, though, takes a decidedly irreverent approach to Dumont's legacy. Her hierarchy, as we've heard before, is not holistic, and it doesn't preclude a valorization of individuals. It's not founded in essential substantive oppositions, such as status and power, purity and pollution, king and Brahman. Indeed, it's not founded in substantives at all, but instead in heres and relations. We hear very little about encompassment and nothing at all about levels, which are key concepts for the more theologically correct neo-Dumontians around, none of whom work on India, I've noticed. This is all quite clever, as it allows Anastasia to correctly deploy the strengths of Dumont's original argument, which derived from the relational analytic he in turn took from his Oxford mentor Evans Pritchard, while discarding the carapace of bolt-on substantives which Dumont needed in order to make his case for treating India as a coherent, self-contained totality. A totality which provides the ultimate exception to the narrative of the inexorable rise of Western individualist modernity, which was his larger project. At the heart of Anastasia's new, stripped back and relational version of hierarchy is a core acknowledgement of asymmetry as the basis of social life. That's a direct quote from the book. Us modern egalitarians constantly misrecognize the ubiquity of asymmetry as an inescapable aspect of social life everywhere, and have an important lesson to learn from those like roguish Andrews, who are connoisseurs of the productive potential of asymmetrical social relations, which in turn is why we should all read this book. There are other reasons too. Dumont is not the only unfashionable dead white man to find his reputation revived in Nobody's People. Another, I was delighted to see, is Kipling, who makes a brief appearance alongside Chris Bailey in a discussion of spies and informants. And there's something of Kim the novel in Anastasia's vivid evocations of the noise and colour of North India, as well as Kim the character and the figure of the intrepid ethnographer, insouciantly leaping across social registers, at one moment swigging country liquor with the old Kanja geezers, before bombing off on her motorbike to sip lemon tea delicately with the ageing Rajput chief, who's returned on a quixotic quest to take up what he imagines to be his rightful political position. That particular encounter is described in my favourite part of the book, the penultimate chapter, which describes with great skill and imagination the vicissitudes of an election campaign at the end of Anastasia's fieldwork. The New Lords of Begun is the most ethnographically present chapter in the book, and all the better for it. It constitutes a state-of-the-art campaign with as much focus on the performative dimensions of local politicking as on the asymmetrical relationships that work in it. For me, it also conveys a much more pluralistic and unruly sense of Indian democracy and the many often contradictory values that inform it than the more theoretically insistent discussions in earlier chapters. Not least amongst these contradictory values is the general sense of opprobrium that attaches to politicians and their promises across the subcontinent and of course far beyond. Well, this could be explained by their expectations of their roles as patrons and providers. That doesn't quite address the mystery of why the electors remain so invested in the democratic process itself, despite its moral failings and material disappointments. Nobody's People is a stimulating book, and as I read it, I was frequently diverted by reflections on parallels and possible non-parallels. I have no problem with the idea that we take seriously the idea of asymmetrical relations as potentially positive, and I hope the book will build on the good work collection on patronage in getting social scientists to take seriously the thick moral idioms that work in everyday experiences of mass politics. I work in mass politics as much in the UK as in India. For example, the anthropologist Insa Kok has written about Brexit voters on a housing estate in southern England, for whom a vote for Brexit was as much a judgment on their political representatives, and particularly their failure to maintain proper social relations with their electors, as it was a comment on anything else. Reflecting on the ubiquity of asymmetry in everyday sociality in Sri Lanka, where I've worked for many years, I also find myself thinking about the moments of somewhat pure asymmetry nested within those relations, as if symmetry and asymmetry are two sides of the same moral coin, interdependent and differently valorized in different contexts. Examples are available, but I won't take your time up with them now. Violence is also an issue left unresolved in the book, which opens with a moment of shocking violence, but then leaves violence rather at the margins of the analysis. And this is one of the points where I think all three of our commentators are beginning to come together. And coercion. In the prologue, one interlocutor asserts that Kanjas are nobody's slaves. How might we then read recent work on Dalit history, for example, like Rupa Viswanath's Pariah problem, which interprets that history in terms of the sedimented experience of unfreedom in brutally coercive agrarian relations? And this obviously is echoing the point that Melinda was making. What is the tipping point, in Anastasia's terms, when rightful service to a patron becomes instead dire compulsion? And with these questions, I'll stop and thank you for attending.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. What I'd like to do now is firstly to invite Anastasia to attempt to start a response to these three sets of comments, and at the same time I'd like to invite our other members of the audience who sadly we can't see, but we would like to hear your questions and comments. So if I could invite you to type those into the Q&A box, and then we'll round those up and bring them into the discussion. There are some wonderful learned people on this call, so we would really like to hear from all of you, or as many of you as we can. But first of all, over to you, Anastasia.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a set of comments that were that did very nicely actually come together in a way that allows me, I think, to reflect on them collectively more easily. And the first and the last is really about violence, of course, with which the book begins. And the reason that I ended up in that particular village was precisely because of that pogrom. And I was originally not interested at all in questions of hierarchy and caste. Cultural degree, and as a South Asianist, it's really suicidal to start thinking about hierarchy and caste by many of my seniors. So I was interested in actually writing an ethnography of one such community, which hasn't really been done with any care before, and with the question of violence between such communities and their neighbors. Now, the argument I'm making is that the unbridled violence that surrounds such communities is precisely a function of the fact that they have fallen out of these hierarchical relationships. And they exist in a world that, if you don't have the hierarchical relationships, which aren't to be confused with unequal relationships, because the world collapses into a lot of terrible stuff. And the people I spent time with in Rajasthan were very, very clear about the difference between what I call hierarchy, which is a normative sensibility of a responsible asymmetrical relationship, which is mutually beholden, and a relationship that is simply marked by differences of wealth, power, ability, and so on, but tied by no responsibility whatever. And the hereditary lord and the way that people reflected on him were a fantastic sort of example of how people differentiated between the two, and that they made absolutely no, there was no muddle at all between, good responsible hierarchical bonds as they imagined them, and as occasionally were instantiated, but not as all normative sensibilities. They are in fact very rarely actualized, and exploitative, violent inequality. On the one hand, the entire town was structured through the rank structure inside the town was structured through memories of connections to the family of the local lord. And in response to Arsalan's question, what about land? What about resources? So a lot of these hereditary servant families were the recipients of enormous grants of land. And in fact, the lord's family itself was left, as historians of India have often, South Asia have often described, the extraordinary, and for the colonial officials could not understand why these kings were often virtually landless, because the practice of giving away stuff, and especially land grants, was very, very present. And this was obvious in the town. And if I had a map of the distribution of land that was, you know, given away by the local royal family to its servants, the kings would look very silly from the commercial point of view. Now, on the one hand, there was all this talk about how wonderful this relationship was and what it gave to all the families. On the other hand, there was the actual local lord who had come back, having been away in Delhi, had come back and tried to reinsert himself into local life, having abandoned the people, having done nothing for them, and having accrued a lot of bitterness against him. Who was judged in terms that were not at all through the idiom of hierarchy. So the judgment, and that chapter that Jonathan mentioned, the final chapter, where he fails to even get enough votes to keep his deposit, and he keeps imagining that he is much more of a lord than he actually is in the eyes of most of the people. That has the variety of views that people have of him. So some are still holding on to the idea, to the hierarchical judgment, that what ought to happen is that this lord, who still does have more money and so on, has more power, has the respect, has the hereditary sort of memory of having the position that he does, that he ought to be doing stuff for his people, right? And that would be right and just and proper. On the other hand, people who had given up on the idea that he was a worthwhile patron at all and could become such, thought that his stuff should be taken and divided, roughly speaking, equally. You know, as in Bulgakov's novel, The Heart of a Dog, there's a dog that's turned into a man, and he says, why think very much about it? Let's take everything and divide it all equally. So there was that judgment too, which is very much a judgment of the situation as being one of inequality, which is to be mended through an egalitarian calculus of distribution, where the commensuration that Melinda talked about, which is a commercial idiom indeed, is the one through which fairness and justice is judged. Other people thought through the hierarchical idiom, thinking that, well, the Lord owes us more, right? It's a very, very different, there are very, very different ways of judging what should be done. And they're both present in the town and in around India, of course. Now, the danger of naturalizing hierarchy, I think, lies in thinking about hierarchy as a kind of thing, as a description of a social pyramid, of a system of rank. And that's what I keep trying to pull our discussions away from, perhaps the very word hierarchy getting in the way of doing so, because it's, of course, so firm to this idea of a pyramid. And if you Google the word hierarchy, you'll come up with lots of pictures of pyramids of rank. And what I'm trying to get us to think about is, as Louise said in her introduction, about hierarchy as a set of norms, as a way of thinking about what ought to be the case. And as I argue, it's really centrally about how we ought to do our relations right, rather than about what we should have and how to equalize that. So the logic is relational rather than commensurative. That takes us, I think, to this point made by Melinda about the rise of egalitarian value and its connection to commercial value. It's actually very different. It's actually very difficult to trace historically, where the sort of very, very prevailing hegemonic idea of equality as the absolute foundation of all social and political good now comes from. And the more I read around its history, the more recent the idea seems to be. But there's certainly, it's the connection, both historical and sort of logical with commercial value and commercial logic is of course undeniable. Now, the other question that Melinda brought up was, can we rethink democratic value in terms of this sort of relational thinking? Well, and can we rethink democratic freedom through what we're observing, not just in India, but very much around the world. And as Arsalan said, there's a nostalgia, there's a rise in sort of interest in hierarchical forms of relations in politics across the world. And I think it's absolutely crucial that we do start to understand democracy, of course, in those terms, and democratic freedoms in terms of the bonds of dependence and responsibility that is imagined as enabled by someone being bigger than you, higher than you, in whatever idioms that asymmetry is seen. Now, Jonathan asked, in terms of thinking about democracy, Jonathan asked, given all this, why are electors so keen on democracy in India? What is it that draws them to the democratic process? And of course, the answers that have been given in numbers of nuanced ways have been about them being really keen on feeling like they are equal to other electors. And that's the principal sort of attraction of the process. I think what's really exciting for people about democracy is the fact that it has reintroduced a mechanism for drawing on one's superiors, for making one's superiors responsible. So what has happened during the colonial period is that the political relationships were very much hollowed of their the content of responsibility, which is the moral content of hierarchy, and turned into very much unequal relationships. And this story of the local Raja is very much typical of what's happened around India at large, but certainly around Rajasthan and northern India. Now, the democratic process reintroduces a very, very simple mechanism by which political leaders responsible and again dependent on those below them. And of course, in the historical terms, there's a lot that has been written about how superiors in India have depended on their subordinates through ritual, in ritual terms, in economic terms. There's elaborate mechanisms for doing so, which have been hollowed out. Now, the democratic process does make the superiors depend on their subordinates. And what's really interesting is the ways in which the former elite has, and in many cases hasn't been able to come back to their older roles. And that highlights the fact, we can see it sort of rolling before our eyes live, just how mobile the process of becoming a superior, and how mobile hierarchy has always been in India. Something that this image of a static pyramid has really belied very drastically. And of course, historical literature in India, literature on Kshatriyization, Rajputization, come kings, and kings have emerged. It's there, but that really hasn't been engaged analytically to think about hierarchy as an incredibly active, incredibly dynamic logic of life where, well, positions don't exactly flip back and forth all the time, but people do rise very dramatically. And my last thing I'm going to say is this Ramesh that I was living with at the time, I saw him exactly a year ago. I stayed with him in the village for a few days because I was there with my 2-year-old daughter. He now has 5 times more land. He now has a big truck. He has 3 motorcycles, including a bullet. So the kind of and this is, he was a man who was, 25 years ago, before the pogrom, he had almost nothing. So this is and again, this is So, you know, one of the ways in which I start the book is I say that this is the rural India was anything but a sleepy sort of. Rajasthan tends to be sort of stereotyped as, but it's the most ambitious, most aspirational place I have ever been in my life.
Thank you, Anastasia. So we have a couple of questions coming in on the chat, and I have one of my own that I'd like to put to you. And in the meantime, I'll encourage others to please raise questions too. I'll use my privilege as chair to put my own question in while it's fresh in my mind, which is to ask, where does the state feature in thinking about hierarchy and about the resilience or otherwise of these hierarchical forms of social relation? I asked that partly motivated by work that I've done in rural Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh in collaboration with Oliver Heath, where we found that where the state is more effective at providing basic public goods. So we were looking particularly at the functioning of the public distribution system and the distribution of jobs through Manrega. So where those things happen more effectively and reliably and on a quasi-universal basis, i.e. not intermediated by forms of clientelistic discretion, that voters, citizens start to potentially think about their vote, and I guess we weren't asking them this, but you might think that they might start to think differently about their engagement in democracy. So the question we were interested in was, where the state is more effective in distributing public goods, does that alter people's inclination to participate in politics in response to inducements to vote? So I suppose to put this question slightly more pithily, might people's dependence on patrons and big men reduce when the state is more effective in providing the goods that they otherwise rely on patrons to provide more effectively? So that's my question. Then we have some other different questions.
Can I answer that briefly, and then we can move on to?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. The way you put it, that is to say, if the state worked properly, none of the stuff would, the entire sort of logic of patronage is then sort of an effect of the defects of the idea. Say how people, first of all, people change their minds. People are not sort of born with genetic, cultural predispositions. They start thinking different things every day. It's very difficult to say what would happen if, and I'd be very interested to find out sort of the conclusions of your study. What would happen if the state sort of produced a perfectly bureaucratic system where everyone was receiving, money equally. What I have seen was quite interesting. In town, there was a district collector who came in and he was extremely upright, and he decided that he's going to cut through some of the processes in distributing land papers, which were in great demand, and got his peons to go around and tell people to just come to his office and get the papers, and nobody came. They still went through their intermediaries and so on. Now, one could say that they simply didn't believe that this was true because they've never experienced a process. Case. It may be, however, that they are doing what they think is right and proper and so on. So that the judgment we may have is only about what we see, and there are plenty of instances where people prefer to still go through intermediaries in situations where they're offered the option of sort of direct kind of bureaucratic distribution. Again, difficult to say whether that's because they just can't even imagine this working, or because there is a norm, a cultural norm, let's say, that they're following.
Thanks. We'll continue this conversation, but I'd like to put some of the other questions that have been coming in from other people. And so Kriti Kapila asks, what do you take as what do you consider the antonym of hierarchy? Is it equality or egalitarianism, or is it sameness? And she said, I mean, I'm sure you can read the chat, but Samta is not the same as Barabari, as you know. And how does your engagement with Dumont depart from that of Dipankar Gupta's, for example, which is based on several competing hierarchies based in different values around which these are coalesced, i.e. not just on the purity pollution axis, and specifically prompts you on the dynamic nature of hierarchy and how that relates to your own argument. Shivatri Dasgupta, I haven't actually read this question in advance, so I'll just read it out loud. Your work tells us very fascinatingly that asymmetry has productive potential. Neoliberal capitalism progresses through effective elements such as greed, under the illusion of egalitarianism. How do the normative elements of hopeful hierarchy wrestle with affects such as greed, even if we don't go as far as violence? And as Dr. Banerjee pointed out, this is such an important endeavour in a world of neoliberal capitalism. She also raises a question that Arslan raised at the beginning, which is the risk of naturalising hierarchy. So I'll ask you, and asks finally how normative hierarchies shape or prevent gender violence in rural Rajasthan. And it would be interesting to hear you to reflect on the kind of relation of hierarchy to patriarchy and gender. Pierre Vitebsky asks, to the extent that you could explain your book to your Kanjar friends, to what extent would they think that you had got it right? Devanshi Chanchani asks a clarificatory question, which he says is related to the one that I asked, which is whether the criminal tribe was on the scheduled tribes list, and did they receive quotas as a result? Oh, and a final question, I think, which is about how do we avoid comparing apples and oranges? The kind of the purpose localized. So I think how far is it possible to universalize from the Rajasthani context more widely? I think that's probably enough. I think there might be some more questions in the Q&A box, but I think that might be enough for now. I think you're muted, Anastasia.
Am I audible now? Yep.
Yes.
So yes, I think the most helpful antonym, because hierarchy is such a, it's the structure of so many things. It's so weird to put such an odd word to it. So I'm still not entirely comfortable with calling what I'm calling hierarchy. If anyone's interested, for a number of reasons. So I think the most helpful antonym is inequality, because it highlights the normative terms and shows, as I was trying to describe with that little ethnographic vignette, just how different the judgment about let's take it and divide it all equally versus why isn't he giving me more? Dipankar Gupta's, as well as a number of other models that have complicated Dumont's, that have taken sort of the single value set model apart and said, look, but there are people in India who value bravery, there are people who value my argument against all of these models is that they are taking the substantive value sets, which are there are very many of them in India, as the basic structure of valuation. And I'm saying that what unites people who who are living across communities that do indeed value different virtues in different communities and different people, that there is an overall shared value placed in a particular sort of relationship. A very simple model, and it's one that isn't exclusive to India, one that is certainly not universal because nothing really is, but one that we find sort of echoes in throughout the world. And the very simple idea is that those with more owe more. I mean, it's really as simple as that. And that owe more to those with less. So that's my argument against all what I call substantivist models of hierarchy. I couldn't quite get what Kriti said about dynamism, but dynamism is precisely at the center of this book. It's a very dynamic, very in action of life. Now, gender and violence, again, this is bringing us back to the failure of the norm or its embodiment. So this is quite complicated because on the one hand, the husband-wife relationships in particular, and gendered violence isn't only men beating up women. There are women beating up men. In front of my house, there were a man with 2 wives who beat him every morning in public, humiliating him. The difficulty with the husband and wife relationship is that it is presumed to be such an inviolable, in many communities, bond that cannot be replaced by anything else. You can't go to another husband. That women do endure and justify often something that in other contexts across their lives, in other forms of relationships that they have, they wouldn't endure at all. So for instance, Baiji, who was garlanding her husband, she was beaten very severely by her husband, who was a drunkard and so on. There was no option for her to abandon to abandon the idea that was an unequal and an unhierarchical relationship, and one that was altogether bad. Now, of course, there are many communities, including the Kanjar, where divorce is an option, where women can divorce husbands, and that sort of violence against women was simply not tolerable for Kanjar women who did divorce their husbands, and the couple I lived with, they were both divorcees, and again, as I was saying, the 2 wives beating their husband, so there was violence, but it wasn't so rigidly structured and inescapable as it is in communities where divorce isn't an option for women. So of course there is a sort of material basis for all of this, and options that are actually available prescribe what can and can't be done, and also how far the norm can stretch. Now the question that Piers asked, to the extent that you could explain this to Kanjars, I did actually. I did explain to them to the extent that I could what my I said, so what? That's it? I mean, yeah. That's right. That's how it works. I mean, so I've described to them a lot of the sort of basic theoretical points, which they said yes, but why would anybody be interested in that? Because isn't that obvious? Was the criminal tribe that the Kanjars are a scheduled tribe? It's a scheduled caste. Most so-called criminal tribes were scheduled castes, in fact, apart from a few, and that means that they have a lot fewer opportunities of employment, education, political office occupation than scheduled tribes. So Kanjars, there's 70-something, 72 scheduled castes in Rajasthan. So the competition for all the reserved positions is fierce. So if that was the question. And I don't think I caught the last one. Oh, how far is it universalizable? That is a question I put out to you, my dear readers. that is a question that the book raises, and I think there, as you read, you will find echoes of this, and you will find limits of what I'm saying as well in the different contexts in which you're studying and also in which you're living.
Thank you. I'd like to leave time to invite our panelists to offer any kind of concluding reflections. But before I do that, I want to put one final question to you, which I think is a very interesting one, from Vishesh Pratap Gujjar, who's a PhD candidate at IIT Delhi. And he says, don't you think that the normative commitment to hierarchy mattered for Kanjas because they were located in a rural area, which has still not seen the complexity of market relations, which bring in multiple roles and relaxation of traditional social norms? So while you disagree that the work is not about rurality, but at the end, the conclusion, he suggests, somehow remains valid mostly for rural India or a rural-urban context rather than an urban locality. And he says, even though many sociologists keep blurring the boundaries of rural and urban, from your conclusions, it seems that they're still standing strong in many senses, and a belief in a different set of values in this different context is one of the reasons why.
So the people in this area are far from unaware of a very intense commercial sort of life and logic. I mean, it's a market town which has had a very vibrant commercial life for a very long time. Now, I can only say things on the basis of my sporadic observations well, I've spent quite a lot of time in different social contexts in North Indian cities, but I haven't written about them ethnographically. So I can say that what I have seen also runs through very elegant sitting rooms in Delhi and in Bombay. And of course, the educated, Anglophone, urbane, well-traveled classes will deny the presence of this kind of thinking in their lives because it's been so thoroughly derided by metropolitan, progressive thinking. But if you observe them in their everyday lives, interacting with their family, with their servants, with their neighbors, and so on, they are not as different from this. But again, these are comments that are not supported by my authority much on this in the urban context. Even saying that, even if what I'm describing is the stuff of so-called urban India, rural India, again, it's not entirely rural because market towns are a different sort of setting where they have been understudied, but that whole space in India still houses about 70% of India's population. And I think that's enough. But I would like to say that this is certainly, there's no clear urban-rural divide here.
Thanks. I'm going to just give the final to our discussants, perhaps in the order that you spoke. Any responses to the discussion so far or concluding reflections? So Arsalan, would you like to go first?
You're inaudible.
Yeah.
I think this project is an overall theoretical framework is incredibly important. I mean, I think that what Anastasia is describing of hierarchy as a normative idiom, as a reflexive idiom to think about all kinds of problems, is just a very widespread that we have downplayed and not really understood, and we haven't thought through its political significance for people. And so I think that, I think in one review article, Anastasia used the phrase, the real ground of politics is to recognize, to not take up the kind of egalitarian normative stance, but to recognize that these are kind of politically in play, right? These different types of idioms are politically in play, and we cannot understand social political life without that. So I think that this is a great service to political theory, and to thinking through democracy and to thinking through politics. And Anastasia has presented that with such clarity, and it's really provocative. That's what I'll say.
Thanks very much, Aslan. Melinda, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you very much, Anastasia, and all the other panelists for their responses. I think, Anastasia, what your book shows is a really fascinating dialectical reversal, very comparable to a kind of Hegelian reversal, where the one who appears to be free, whether it's because of by virtue of the constitution or liberal political rights or elections or whatever, actually is shown to reveal a facade of legitimizing equality, which is the classic bourgeois constitutionalism and the state. And the one which appears to be unfree, all these relationships of social responsibility, appears in fact to be a staircase towards achieving a better life and more freedom, that by working through kind of making the superiors socially responsible. And what this kind of brings me to my main point, responding to one of Louise's comments as well, is of course, I think we should not make too much of an absolute distinction between the state and the community. I know the subaltern studies did that. And there are other people who go in the opposite direction of saying the good state, which gives rights, versus the bad community, which is about hierarchy, patronage, and so on. But what we, of course, forget in the process is that the post-colonial Indian state would not have become the constitutional state it is without the prior history of popular constitutionalism from below, of popular rights consciousness. So with the Rajbangshis, in the 1910s, when you have the Government of India Act of 1919, the Rajbangshis are like, this is not going to work because this is going to give power to the high caste. What we need is to show, and they produce a fascinating discourse in 1917 of a movement from Parashasan, the rule of the other, to Atmashasan, to self-rule, where the rule of the other becomes a mere slave or mere servant, a kinkaramatra of self-rule. And now without this kind of prehistory, and there are countless other communities like that, Dalit and non-Dalit across India, who agitated for this kind of constitutionalism from below, produced through community deliberations, caste meetings, and associations, which produced and were circumscribed by the constitution which emerges after 1947. So we need to understand the social responsibility idioms which are there among the communities in order to even better understand the state and how to make the state more responsible, rather than assuming the state as the fountain and origin of rights. And my last very brief point is about the question of social responsibility with respect to gender. I mean, one other point which I would bring in from the Bengal perspective is the importance of idioms of matriarchy. The rule of the woman, the rule of the maternal woman, the rule of the goddess. In pre-modern Bengal, if you look at the textual tradition like the Chondi Mongol, it's Chondi, the goddess, who brings non-violence to the forest, who protects the non-human, who protects the forest, and institutes good government, not a male god. It's again Manusha, the goddess of snakes, who institutes good government, and so on. And of course, in 19th, 20th century, what happens is feminists, if you think of Begum Rokea's Ladyland. Ladyland is a hierarchical text. It's a text about a kingdom ruled by a queen, but it's a feminist utopia. So I think feminists often very cleverly pick up on these long-standing matriarchal traditions to say, actually, the good government, where the governor will be responsible to the ruled, would be when the women would rule. And this remains a leitmotif in a lot of feminist intellectual history for a long time. So a fascinating twist to using the idiom of social responsibility of the superior to the inferior to actually say it's much better when women are the superior and the men are the inferior. It's fascinating dialectical reversal.
Thanks, Melinda. And just finally to Jonathan.
Sorry, I lost my cursor for a minute then. I was struggling to unmute. Yeah, just two points. One is about the H word. Asymmetry, which is the landing point in the book, point of rest in the analysis in the book, seems to me to be a much easier word to use in lots of contexts, both within South Asia, but also well beyond South Asia, because doesn't have the knee-jerk reaction that the word hierarchy might attract for some people. And one of the problems, and Anastasia's heroic attempts possibly to take the Dumont out of Dumont. It's a bit like those of you can that most of Marx wasn't really Marxist, and so Anastasia has a version of Dumont where you extract most of it. The trouble is that the word hierarchy itself is a totalizing word. I mean, that's the whole point of the word, and it has all that baggage. And you can read, as you read the book, there's this, you can sense that the narrator being tempted down the road of totalization all the time and then pushing back against it and qualifying and saying, I don't really mean that, and I don't. Whereas if you're talking about idioms and you're talking about certain kinds of relationship, there is no problem at ubiquity rather than totalizing. You know, I was using ubiquity in my comments. These are ubiquitous relations that we find around the world, and that the, you know, more sociologically naive language of certain kinds of political science, well, obviously not anybody who's present at the moment, but certain kinds of political science strip out the content of these relations, and we're left puzzling why electors on a council estate in Oxford would vote for Brexit, why people in Kansas vote for Trump, and so on. And if we start thinking back to the need to repersonalize at least the political imagination, we're back in business again. But I don't know that you can do it with the H word personally, because I just think that there are too many other things that happen when you bring that in.
Thanks, Jonathan.